So, between 1960 and 1980, the entire idea of what equality means in the United States was turned on its head. We're going to unpack this really critical 20-year period and look at the movements that completely reshaped the country. This era was just defined by a massive explosion of activism. The fight for civil rights suddenly expanded way beyond its original focus. You had Latino, American Indian, Asian American, feminist, and LGBTQ activists all mobilizing pretty much at the same time, each one demanding to be heard. In this 20-year window, it was packed with protests, really radical demands, and eventually huge legislative and social changes that left the nation looking totally different by 1980. Okay, first up, let's explore two really powerful movements. Both were deeply rooted in demands for control over land, fair labor, and, crucially, the right to govern themselves. The Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, really burst onto the national scene through the struggle of agricultural workers. It was led by the incredible Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and their organization, the United Farm Workers, started with a fight for better wages, but quickly grew into something much bigger, a movement for cultural pride and political power. Now, the UFW's masterstroke was the nationwide Great Boycott. This was brilliant. Instead of just striking out in the fields, they took the fight to grocery stores all across America. They got students, religious groups, and other unions on their side to apply this immense economic and moral pressure. What a strategy. At the very same time, the American Indian Movement, or AAM, was fighting for something just as fundamental: tribal sovereignty. Their main demand was for the U.S. government to finally honor centuries of broken treaties. And their strategy? It was dramatic. They used these high-profile occupations of federal land, like the 19-month takeover of Alcatraz Island and a 71-day standoff at Wounded Knee. So you see, while their strategies couldn't have been more different, one an economic boycott, the other a symbolic occupation, both movements had massive success. The UFW won better wages and got national attention, and AIM's activism led directly to the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. And that was a monumental law that basically reversed decades of harmful government policy. All right, next, let's look at two movements that were masters at building coalitions, kind of like the UFW, and they focused on fighting to change established institutions from the inside out. A really key strategy for Asian American activism was this idea of Pan-Asian solidarity. This meant bringing together all these diverse communities: Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, groups that hadn't always seen themselves as one single political force. Just the act of uniting was in itself an incredibly powerful political statement. And this idea of building coalitions was absolutely central. You had groups like the Asian American Political Alliance, the AAPA, focusing on that unity. You had leaders like Larry Itliong working right alongside Cesar Chavez in the farm worker movement. And activists like Yuri Kochiyama were building cross-racial solidarity in cities. It all kind of came to a head with the big student-led strike at San Francisco State. And that strike, it was a game changer. After months and months of protest, the students won. And their victory led to the creation of the very first College of Ethnic Studies in the entire United States. This wasn't just a win for Asian Americans. It institutionalized multicultural education and kicked the door open for Black, Chicano, and Native American studies programs all over the country. Okay, now let's turn to second-wave feminism. A lot of people point to this one powerful quote from Betty Friedan's 1963 book as the spark. She just perfectly named this problem that has no name, giving a voice to the deep dissatisfaction that millions of women were feeling. It created a feminist consciousness that very quickly turned into organized action. The movement fought on a lot of different fronts, and it had a massive legislative win, but also a really significant failure. The big win was Title IX in 1972, which totally transformed education and sports for women. But the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which honestly seemed like a sure thing, ended up failing. And that was largely due to a highly effective counter-campaign led by Phyllis Schlafly, who argued the ERA was a threat to traditional family values. But the movement did secure another monumental victory, this time in the courts. A central goal was reproductive autonomy, and that fight led to the 1973 Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade. It established a woman's constitutional right to an abortion, a ruling that, as we know, remains absolutely central to American politics to this day. Our final section covers a movement that was ignited not by a planned march, not by a book, not by a piece of legislation, but by a single, spontaneous, and violent act of rebellion. So you gotta ask, what was the Stonewall Uprising in 1969? What actually happened? Well, to really get its power, you first have to understand what it wasn't. This was not some organized demonstration. It wasn't a polite request for acceptance. Not at all. It was a riot, a raw, spontaneous eruption against decades of constant police harassment. The people at the Stonewall Inn, especially trans women of color and street youth, the most marginalized people in the community, they just fought back. And that raw, radical beginning shaped everything that came after it. Groups like the Gay Liberation Front popped up, and they weren't asking for tolerance, they were demanding total liberation. Pioneers like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were right there at Stonewall, went on to found STAR to protect the community's most vulnerable members. And this new, much more vocal activism led to a stunning institutional victory just 4 years later. In 1973, because of intense pressure from activists, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. That was a fundamental, game-changing step toward legitimizing LGBTQ+ identities. So, we've looked at 5 really distinct movements here, and they might seem different on the surface, but if you look closer, there's a powerful common thread that connects every single one of them. And that thread was a demand for self-determination. See, this wasn't just about asking for a seat at the existing table. This was about having the power to define your own identity, control your own institutions, and shape your own future. Think about it this way. These movements weren't just asking to be let into the system as it was. They were demanding the right to fundamentally change the system itself, to change the whole table, or, if that didn't work, to just build a new one altogether. And this brings us to a final big question to chew on. How did that push for things like ethnic studies and cultural identity fundamentally change the relationship between education, who we are, and political power in the United States? And how do we see the legacy of that change playing out all around us today?